So, Drew, how are you keeping within these sort of the confines of COVID-19 in South Carolina?
Hey David, how are you? I'm doing okay, as well as can be expected within the mostly four walls of figuratively speaking of house, home, and backyard.
Yeah, and plenty of birding going on.
Well, yeah, mostly backyard stuff, sitting in one spot and letting migration bring some pretty cool stuff to me. Fascinated with rose-breasted grosbeaks right now. And with it being John James Audubon's birthday, he called rose-breasted grosbeaks bleeding hearts, I believe. So I just left one in the backyard a few minutes ago. So waiting for hopefully the next south winds to bring some more good stuff to me.
My first ever rose-breasted grosbeak was actually in England. Would you believe that?
And so there were probably hundreds, right? Hundreds of people there with you.
Yes, I was on the Isles of Scilly, which is one of the most, I think it's the most westerly place you can be in Britain. They're islands off Cornwall, and it was back in the 80s, and one turned up. It wasn't even an adult, it was a juvenile, but it was a major floor filler, definitely. So everyone here, let me introduce you to Drew. Again, he's got quite a CV here. You actually down as J. Drew Lanham.
Yep.
The J's for Joseph. Do you not call yourself Joseph at all?
I don't, mainly because people want to shorten it to Joe or right. Joey. So.
Okay, fair enough. Drew, you're an author, poet, and a wildlife biologist. You were raised in South Carolina, studied zoology and ecology at Clemson University, but I understand that you actually originally studied mechanical engineering before switching to biology. Why was that? Or zoology, why was that?
Well, David, it was sort of a typical story, and it was at the beginning of this whole STEM movement, this science, technology, engineering, and math movement, to bring more people of color into the disciplines, into those STEM disciplines. And I was good in math and science. And everyone told me that when I told them I wanted to be an ornithologist, first of all, 9 out of 10 people were like, "What's that?" And then I'd say, "Well, I want to be a zoologist." And they say, "Well, but why do you want to work at a zoo?" And so once people understood that I was good at math and science, I got a scholarship actually to do marine biology at a school called Hampton University. It's Hampton Institute then. But then I got a larger scholarship that paid my way through school fully in mechanical engineering or any engineering. And everyone told me, you can't turn that scholarship down. It's the full ride. It's a guaranteed job anywhere in the world with EI, DuPont, de Nemours. You can't turn that down. And so I didn't. I bent to expectation and was in mechanical engineering for 3.5 miserable years. Didn't do badly at it, but I wasn't passionate about it. And I would find ways during my summer internship as an engineer to slip out to the ecology lab at the Savannah River site. During the school year, I would find ways to go through the biological sciences building just so I could smell the collections there. So 3.5 years in, David, I changed my major to zoology, and it changed my life. So I always tell people, if you're in any sort of passionless pursuit, get out of it. Find your passion and then follow that. And so that's what I did.
Wise words. And you must have had a bit of pushback on your decision to switch from the mechanical engineering to zoology, no?
A ton. Well, the first pushback was that I lost my scholarship. And so even though I begged and pleaded, I said, I'm going to be a scientist, so I'm sure I'll be able to help the world that way. And a lot of people just didn't have any idea what a zoologist would do beyond what they thought was working at a zoo, as being a zookeeper. And I did that for um, for a year, literally shoveling elephant poo for a while. But you know, the pushback really only sort of strengthened my resolve to be successful. Once I made the turn, there was no turning back. And you know, what had seemed like drudgery school-wise suddenly became just amazingly easy. I loved everything except biochemistry. I hated biochemistry,
Right.
but everything else I loved. And any course dealing with natural history, vertebrate zoology, even invertebrate zoology, all of it to me was just food presented on a platter that I had been hungry for, that I had been craving for a long time. And so, you know, the pushback was sort of constant, honestly. And part of the pushback was, well, why would a black guy do that? You know, why would, who else is out there for you? So, yeah, and that pushback still comes sometimes, and people don't understand, you know, sort of the passion that I'm pursuing, but that's okay. I'm happy.
And that pushback, was it from black people as well as white people?
Yeah, yeah, it was. Really, probably it initially sort of, especially from some of my friends who didn't understand why I was going to these far-flung places alone, and places, quite frankly, that had some history that would give you pause as a black person to go. I always say that trees don't mean the same thing to everyone, especially if there's a history of people having been hung from them. Then it gives people pause to think about doing some of the things that I was doing as a wildlife biologist, sort of from a cultural standpoint. And then from sort of a risk standpoint, that one of my first jobs was hacking peregrine falcons off of the ledges of a local lake. That breeding population is doing well now. But when you tell people, oh, I spent the day hanging off of a cliff face, hacking peregrine falcons, or I spent the day looking for shrews, or I spent the night chasing an alligator around a lake, you get sort of odd looks, because guess what? You know, there weren't any visible people of color at that point in time doing it. And so there were questions. There was that sort of pushback from people who knew me or thought they knew me, and thought maybe I was misplaced in what I was doing.
It's interesting because I had a sort of a minor version of that when I started learning how to, well, when I got into nature full stop as a kid. And I lived in a black Irish neighborhood, and a lot of black kids were saying to me, why are you interested in birds? That's very English, in their false patois accents. And I was saying, well, hang on a minute, you were born here as well. So what are you talking about? But I learned how to be a very fast runner. I was quite good at running at school. Whilst at university, you earned a PhD, and in 1997, and you also hold the endowed chair as the alumni distinguished professor, as an alumni distinguished professor, which is a pretty great accolade, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's, you know, it's always an honor to be honored by others, but when your peers see fit to recognize you for what you do, that's always a critical thing to me. And that was an award that in large part is decided upon by the alumni, but also by students and other peers. So, you know, they say a prophet is without merit in their own home. I'm no prophet, but I would offer that professors are sort of the same way. So yeah, it was quite the honor, and still the honor whenever you know, my university and my peers recognize me in any sort of way, because I'm doing some different stuff. I'm not just doing the bird stuff, David. I'm, you know, trying to make these connections between culture and conservation, between birds and black people, between birds and all people, really. But the data that I know best is me, and I happen to be a black man, a black Southern man, a black Southern rural man. So I like to talk about how those connections between who I am and who birds are, not just what they are, but who those birds are, you know, how they come together, hopefully to move us forward to save birds, habitats, and humanity in some ways. So yeah, I'm lucky, you know, I'm lucky in being able to do those things that I do.
Excellent. We'll get on to your work when it comes to trying to engage with Afro-Americans and getting them involved in conservation in a minute. But let's wind back a bit. Let's find out where the young Drew, or how the young Drew got interested in nature in the first place.
Man, I grew up in the boondocks. I grew up in the middle of the woods. Really, it was a family farm, but it was surrounded by these wonderful woods, a national forest. In fact, the Long Cane Ranger District of the Sumter National Forest. And even though I have 3 siblings, I spent a great deal of time with my grandmother. And the walk from my grandmother's house daily to my parents' house was probably almost a quarter of a mile. And a kid can find a lot to do in a quarter of a mile of pastures and fields and forests and puddles. And so everything that was in a puddle, I wanted to understand what it was. Everything that flew across my head in transit, I wanted to not only know what it was, I also wanted to fly. So as a kid, I was immersed in it. Both my parents were science teachers. My father was an earth science teacher and geologist. My mother was a biology teacher. So, and we were farmers. So it was almost inevitable, I think, that I would fall in love with nature, because it was so much of what, not only of what I knew and what I was learning and what I was interested in, David, but it was, I mean, we grew all of our vegetables. We grew our beef. We grew our pork. So understanding life and life cycles was a part of our life cycle. I couldn't separate myself from any of it. It was just who I was. And so I remember going to school and envying kids because we had no sidewalks. We had only dirt roads. And I would hear kids talking about skating, and they would ask me if I knew how to skate. And I didn't know how to skate because there was nowhere to skate. I couldn't skateboard. There were no sidewalks to skateboard on. I remember on those occasions when we'd take our bikes up the road, up the dirt road, and ride on the blacktop. And for a while on that asphalt, we'd have to sneak and do it because my parents had forbidden it. But I remember the first time being on asphalt on my bicycle was like flying, because it was like there was no resistance. And I remember being on this long glide down this gradual hill. And it was, man, you could take your hands off the handlebars and you could just sail. And so that's what it was like being a kid growing up. It was a lot of hard work, but fun was everywhere for me. It was the next puddle. It was, the next patch of brambles where bobwhite quail would flush. It was hearing whippoorwills at night. It was hearing barred owls in the morning. It was hearing foxes bark. I love that sound of foxes barking. So yeah, it was an immersion, man. I was deep, still am.
Fantastic. You were a former member of several conservation organizations, former board member, should I say, including South Carolina Wildlife Federation, Audubon, South Carolina, and the American Birding Association, amongst others, and also an advisory board member for the North American Environmental Education.
North American Association of Environmental Educators.
Sorry, yes, of course. And in 2019, you awarded the National Audubon Society's Dan W. Lufkin Prize for Environmental Leadership, which recognizes individuals who have dedicated their entire lives to the environment, which is amazing. In 2013, you wrote a piece for Orion magazine entitled 9 Rules for the Black Birdwatcher. Can you tell us about that? And then let's talk more about your work connecting people with conservation and nature.
Yeah, that piece in 2013, David, I'd written for Orion before. As a matter of fact, my first piece was about birding in South Africa, and an encounter that I had there that made me look beyond the birds for really some answers as to how we connect with nature. And so that was really sort of the impetus for it, really, that first South African article. But I got a call from an editor and said, would you be interested in writing a piece for this section called enumeration? And then I said, sure. Any opportunity to write for Orion, which is, I mean, it's the plum, it's the cherry on the cake for environmental writers, for nature writers. So they said, can you write something about, bird watching? And I said, sure. They said, okay, well, send us something. If you can send us something in a week or two, we'd be happy. I sent something back in 45 minutes because I wrote what I had been thinking about, what I had been living in some ways. And so those 9 rules were following on the shooting of Trayvon Martin in Florida. Even though it wasn't the first shooting of an unarmed Black person, it made the news in a spectacularly horrific sort of way. So, my first rule was not wearing a hoodie, because what I had begun to experience and what we had begun to experience here in America was so much symbolism, and people were wearing hoodies, and people were beginning to think about social justice in this very, again, activist way, I think. So that first rule was sort of bringing in that the advent of that cultural phenomenon of the hoodie, which who'd ever thought about a hoodie in that kind of way before? But then what happens when you're a birder doing that, and what might you have to think about as a birder who happens to be Black, and what you're wearing? What does that have to do with anything? And so those 9 rules, being mistaken for the other Black birder, which, I mean, has happened at festivals. Yes, David, someone has actually approached me and asked me if I was David Lindo. And I said, I'm like, no, I wish I'm not there. I can aspire to be like David. But so those sorts of things, those rules for me were part of what I lived. And so I was able to turn it around in less than an hour, and they edited out one piece. And I had no idea that it would take off like it did. But for me, again, it was lived experience. And I think it's satire, but I think that's a way to get to people, that if you can have people laugh, but then halt in their laughing to think about whether they should laugh, and then ask a question about why they had to even think about whether they laughed, then I think you get to people maybe in a different place. And comedy has always been a really good way to go at people. And I would never compare myself to any comedian, but I think about Dick Gregory, for example, and what Dick Gregory was able to move forward as a comedian and an activist. So I wanted it to be funny, but I wanted it to be laughable, but I wanted it not to be funny and laughable. I wanted it to be sort of confounding, so that people said, so it's a little different being a Black birder in this country. And I could say, yeah, sure, it is. It's different being a Black person in this country, no matter what you do. You could be, walking while Black, or driving while Black, or just living while Black. It's a different experience.
That's true, because being a black person in the UK is far different to being a black person in the US. Um, but going back to the nature side of things, there's a lot of talk at the moment online about how there's a lack of diversity in the UK sort of conservation world due to racism, which I just can't see, because I've been birding all my life and I've never had any problem with anyone apart from once, but never, all that time. And then I go to America and I feel the tension. I was
Mm,
in Ohio in November, and I was in a school which was, Afro American kids who were basically, had single parents, and some were drug addicts and all that sort of stuff. And you suddenly realize, you ask them, would you walk around your neighborhood to watch birds? And the answer was no way. It's gangs, and it's just a whole different world. And
mm.
I've known Drew, by the way, guys, for about 8 years now. I met you in Texas in the Rio Grande Valley Festival. And I remember one of our first exchanges was about the your 9 rules. And I remember saying to you, but I didn't actually find it funny. And I wasn't, I was maybe a bit rude to you, I think, but I just said, I don't get it. But actually, since then, since thinking about it and actually looking at it again, I realized just how important it is, because it is speaking to a different audience to, for example, speaking to someone in the UK. And I think everything has its place, really. So, I just want to know what it's like to be. I mean, you're in South Carolina, and when I think of South Carolina, I start sweating and getting scared. I think
Mm,
to myself, I can't really be. I think about Mississippi burning and all that sort of stuff.
yeah.
What's it like there? I mean, as a black guy going birding or doing anything there, is it as sort of as dark as people as we think it is in terms of the media?
Well, it's always interesting. First of all, thank you. That first meeting that we had, I remember that, and our conversations. So you know what, I appreciate that, man. That revelation. But one of the things I always tell people, the South is it's obviously a conundrum, and it's a center for so much of what jumped off. But I always tell my friends in New York or Vermont or wherever, where I always tell them, as much as people point to the South, for example, for enslavement, I mean, it was all being financed by it was being financed by people out of the North and by Great Britain. So um, and the French to some extent. So, enslavement was such a global deal, but it falls on the South because if you think about those first great strides in the civil rights movement, they were made here. So, growing up in South Carolina, I was sort of in that first group of kids in desegregation. So, I grew up sort of in a desegregated world. And as a matter of fact, my first true birding buddy was a white guy named Carl Montgomery. And had it not been for that guy who accepted me as a bird brain like he was, I don't think I'd be an ornithologist today. But Carl and he was white, I was black. Um, I know we recognize the differences in one another. We were friends throughout our school years, but and we could be friends. Carl and I could be friends without any recourse. But I remember, as I went through school, especially as I got to high school, and issues, for example, of dating came up, and who you could date and who you couldn't date. There was an understanding back then in the 80s, way back then, that you stayed within your race, that it might be dangerous for you to go outside of that. And so, those are some of the things that I grew up sort of living with. But then as I got into college and a little beyond it, and I would travel, I would find some of those same issues in other places, or some of the same tensions in other places. And sometimes when the tensions didn't exist in other places, it was because there weren't any black people or people of color there. And so people would tell me, this place is great. And I would look around and I would say, yeah, it's homogenous. So the South deserves a lot of the rap that it gets, but it also doesn't deserve, I think, from my point of view, this is where the great strides are going to be made. The great strides in understanding how we're all connected to one another genetically, how we are connected to one another in so many cultural ways, and the ways that we have to understand our history and not forget it, but build upon it in ways of telling the truth. I think about Mandela's reconciliation, and I think our country still has to go through some of that. And part of the way that I want to do that, David, is through birds and nature, because we all depend on it. You know, when I take people birding in the South Carolina Low Country down in Charleston, and I'm going to take you. I'm inviting you now. I want to take you on a tour of South Carolina, and we go to the Low Country, man, and in the wintertime, it's just full of waterfowl. And in the shoulder of the season, as winter goes into spring, there are shorebirds returning. There are white pelicans around. There are wood storks. There are bald eagles. We've had whooping cranes that have come through. And people are watching all of this frequently on these impoundments that they've assumed that our Department of Natural Resources have created. And I have to take the binoculars down at that point, and you say, you know what? These were created by enslaved peoples. And then people are sort of shocked by that you've taken them from this present moment of looking at black-necked stilts and red-winged blackbirds and thinking about black rails back to black enslaved people. Well, to me, there's no disconnection. Those birds likely would not have the success there if people had not created, but through servitude, those environments. So telling those stories, I think, gets not only those white folks, the majority of people who are out there birding and enjoying nature, at least in the ways that we've defined enjoying nature, though we can argue that, but then it also gives people a chance to live their history, to understand that they own the land as much as anyone else. And if they understand that they own the land as much as anyone else, then they understand that there's an investment there, blood, sweat, tears, lives that they should not shun. That you begin to own the land when you appreciate the land and the birds. So that's why I think the South is so important. You know, I have family here, I have friends here. The ecology here is beautiful. I hate the politics by and large, let me tell you. You know, I've got a very large left arm, and I wear my heart on it. But I think this is where I can change the world from where I live. You know, it's sort of like watching birds in my backyard. We can't go anywhere right now. We're not supposed to go far from home. But when that rose-breasted grosbeak shows up, when that bleeding heart shows up in my yard, man, I'm not just thinking about that bird in my yard. I'm thinking about how that bird got here from Central America, how it crossed the Gulf of Mexico, all that it had to overcome, that one bird to be in my yard. And so then I have to think about everything. I can't just think about that bird or listing it. So that's how I see birding. That's how I see home.
Powerful. So your mission is to color the conservation conversation. How'd you go about that?
Well, it's birds are the conduit, man. You know, the two of us. I mean, you know, when I watch you marvel over birds, you're transformed. I mean, it's a transcendent thing. You know, you look at a bird, and if you get into this, man, suddenly you don't even understand where you are. That's why you can end up standing in an ant nest, and you don't know until you're covered with them what's going on. So I think for me, birds are the conduit to get people connected to something larger than themselves. And people become connected to movements because they're larger than themselves. So I see nature as a movement that we depend on. It's a movement that's there. It's going on around us. What we have to do is to jump on and be a part of the movement. To be left out of a movement is to be disengaged. To be disengaged is to be disenfranchised. To be disenfranchised is to be disrespected. And all the bad things flow from being disrespected. So to enfranchise, to become a part of nature is what I want people to do. It can be birds, maybe it's boulders, maybe it's butterflies. Whatever it is, whatever the way that you can get into nature, get into it, man. And understand that, you know, the same air, the same water, the same soil, we all share the same earth. And that we're sharing all these things with all these other living beings means that we just can't treat other beings any sort of way. So again, for me, to color that conservation conversation means to bring a different set of people in, and not to have them do what I want them to do, but to listen first. And people will tell you how they're involved. They will tell you, you know what? I go fishing, and I'm not catching fish and throwing them back. I'm catching fish and taking them home for dinner. So then I think, you know, I have to become a fisher person. I have to become someone who's aware that, you know what? They're talking about issues of clean water. They're talking about issues of climate change with changes in the tides. So, you know, there are lots of different people involved in nature. I think we have to listen first, just like we listen for birds. And then we can begin to identify from that listening and watching what the issues are, and then we can meet people where they are. I've sort of gotten to the point in my career where I'm getting away from trying to pull people exactly where I want them to be, you know, because they're going to resist. They're going to say, well, why do I have to do what you do? I'm doing it this way. So I need to sit back and watch sometimes and say, okay, so, you know, so for me now, a lot of birding, and I've actually, David, gone back to calling myself a bird watcher.
As opposed to a birder.
Yeah. I mean, not that I'm not a birder, but bird watching implies to me a different intensity. So right now in the backyard, I can't pile up a huge list like I would, you know, at the Black Swamp Bird Observatory. As much as I would love to be there with so many of my friends experiencing that migration, you know, I'm seeing relatively few birds in my backyard. So I've gotten to know my cardinals really well. I'm beginning to understand the difference, not only in the cardinal that doesn't have the crest that's quite as erect as the other one, or the cardinal the male who has a little more gray on his back than the other, or the female that's beginning to molt. And I'm beginning to understand their dynamic. I'm watching birds with a different intensity. This situation has forced me to be more of a bird watcher than a birder.
Very interesting. At this stage of the evening, I wondered if anyone out there would like to ask a question of Drew.
Hi, guys.
I have a question, Drew. Hi.
Hi. How are
I'm
you?
Ronique, and I'm wonderful. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. I saw you speak last year in Seattle here, and I also saw you speak the year before for Bird Note Live. And I haven't got to meet you yet, but I would love to meet you at some point. And I read your book last year, and it was one of my favorite books. And
Well, thank
I
you.
love your writing. Yeah, I love your writing. It's phenomenal. And I'm really happy that David has you on the show today. And the question I want to ask is a question that I asked Jason Ward when David Lindo had him on the show the other day. As a bird guide, if I'm wanting to create a more welcoming environment for maybe people who have never birded before, or people who don't feel comfortable, especially for people of color. And how can I do that? How can I create a more welcoming environment as a non-person of color to people who are interested in birding who are Black or Afro-American? How can I create a more accepting and welcoming environment?
That's a great question. And I look forward to meeting you in Seattle when all this stuff calms down. I look forward to that. For me as a bird guide, one of the ways that I try to make people comfortable is first I slow down. And hopefully to have a relatively small group. I've done groups of 40 or 50 at the Rio Grande Valley Bird Festival in Texas, and I recognize that there is oftentimes a dynamic to those groups. You've got the people out front who want to see the birds first, who want to, there a lot of times it's sort of people who probably think they should be leading. Then
Yeah.
you've got those, then you got those people in the middle, right? Those people in the middle who they want to see the birds, but they're going to linger maybe a little more, and they're noticing other things. They're not just looking up, but they're looking down. They're looking, and they're probably. But then you've got the group in the back. Those that I call their riding drag. That's an old term from the cowboy movie days where you're catching all the dust. And I love riding drag with people because those are the people who may not be the skilled birders, so to speak. They're not calling out the species, even though there are going to be some of them back there. But they are people who are not afraid to learn. They're not afraid to miss a bird, but what I found is they hardly ever miss birds. So recognize the dynamic of your group. Try to have a smaller group. Slow down. Think about the most common bird that you could think about seeing, and don't bypass that bird. Understand that bird to the point that you can tell a story of that bird. I love telling starling stories, and I know it horrifies people, but starlings right now are my model bird for loving something from a distance, because people cry over murmurations. Literally, they cry over seeing these ballets, but then they turn into hate mongers when they see a starling up close. And so I tell the story of starlings in America as being unwilling immigrants. They were brought here at the will of someone else, and they became successful. That's an American story.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I love that.
So tell the stories. Stop at the birds. Tell those stories as you stop at the birds. And as you tell those stories as you stop at the birds, then people will have a chance to not only count birds, but understand who the birds are.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's great.
You're very welcome. Look forward to seeing you next time in Seattle, okay?
Me too. Thank you.
Good.
All right, take care.
Anyone else for a question?
I do.
Hello, Nicole. How are you?
Nicole!
Good. Hi, Drew.
Hey, how are you, friend?
Good. I'm doing well. I don't know if you can, it's kind of dark, but if you can see me, I know you can hear me, but
oh yeah.
I'm really excited to be a part of this. This is awesome. I'm like almost in tears listening to you, Drew, because it's been a while since we've seen each other and talked to each other.
Was it Wisconsin Prairie last time we saw one another?
Yeah, Aldo Leopold Foundation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
I actually just did a session, like a webinar with Mossy, not this past week. So I got to check in with her. But yeah, I really miss you. You're awesome. I'm just thinking about all the layers of things you were saying from just your storytelling style, which I think is very profound. But also thinking about what you were saying with, it's not just about birds. There's all of these other layers woven into this bigger kind of fabric that you've created for yourself yourself in getting people connected to birds and nature and understanding sense of place and history and all those things. And I kind of just wanted to ask, just based off those things you were saying about perspective and slowing down and kind of resetting yourself in a different way with familiar things. Have you experienced or encountered any of that with someone who wasn't necessarily interested in birding, but because you told a story, it got them to reconnect to a natural space or a space outdoors in a different way?
Yeah, Nicole, I have, and part of that is happening at this place called Montpelier in Virginia, and it's where the Constitution essentially was. So much of it was framed by James Madison, and you're walking around those woods with people, and you're watching birds, and there's so much else there. And this time I was supposed to be there a couple of weeks ago, and I'm supposed to be, and I won't be, but I'll be doing a virtual bird walk. So I want to make sure that you're a part of that. But in telling the stories, for example, of a bird, of a wood thrush, for example, which is a very special bird to me, telling the story of that wood thrush being sort of an invisible bird, but that you hear its song. And people who've never heard a wood thrush song, suddenly they hear that song. But then at the same time, I'm asking them, so you're hearing that song, but you're not seeing that bird. Imagine hearing the songs of people working the land, as enslaved peoples were working that constitutional landscape. And imagine hearing the songs of people working the land, but not appreciating who those people are. And you can sort of see people something different turns on in them, and they've made a connection between a bird that they may have never seen, but they're hearing, people that they have never seen, but they see the evidence of their working, and suddenly things come together. So that's one of the ways I think, Nicole, that understanding the history of the places where we are, it's sort of be like, can you imagine, I've never done this, but imagine taking people birding at Mount Rushmore, all right? Or in the Black Hills of South Dakota, period. And there happen to be native peoples with you. And a golden eagle lands on the tip of Teddy Roosevelt's nose. And you talk about the beauty of this eagle, you talk about the wonder of this bird, but you never talk about those white men on that wall and the impact that they had on this sacred place where you are. So at that point, I think that's part of sometimes what we do is we overlook the bigger story for the easy story. So don't be afraid, Nicole, to tell those stories of those birds, those larger stories. And I see it happen all the time. I see people who aren't birders per se, but I think they're way more bird watchers than people would admit, because everybody has a bird story. Everybody has a bird story. So if someone has become an expert in something, I think about people who feed pigeons, and they know those pigeons. They know individual pigeons. I think about Margaret Moore's niece, who did all those wonderful studies on song sparrows. She became an expert on song sparrows. She's no less a bird watcher than someone who has hundreds or thousands of birds on their list. So I think we have to sort of reframe who we are, but more than who we are, we have to reframe who we'll accept into the club. Because, it can be a pretty exclusive club, right?
Yeah.
So I think you have to, and I know you're a powerful storyteller. I know you know a lot about a lot of stuff. So I think that's part of, and and it doesn't happen everywhere. So, I've got a group of those 50 people off of a tour bus somewhere. Well, I've got to tend to business and I've got to, show them certain things maybe. But, I love those groups of, 6, 8, a dozen people. Oh man, we can change the world that way. So, go at it that way. I think, go at it. I've experienced it. And it's one of the things that keeps me going. When somebody tells me I've never connected, look, I can tell you, Dave LaPuma and we've dragged people all across the state of Wisconsin. And all of those people weren't expert birders. But by the end of the week, the changes in people and their appreciation for nature, for birds, for prairie, for, Mississippi alluvial floodplain, incredible. I'll take that any day of the week as opposed to a longer list.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. I've been doing more bird outings, and I'm realizing that people are really drawn to the storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little bit more hesitant to use it right away, even though it speaks to me, and I want to tell as many stories as I can to help connect those dots for people in a way that makes sense for them. But I still do have a lot of, I guess, fear in being too, like the story being too heavy. But then if it works, it works. Like someone will find a connection in it somehow, some way. I can't force it. But just reminding myself to be myself and who I am and why I love what I do, and continue having that passion. But also being inspired. Like I think that's the other thing of just humbling yourself in a way and being inspired by hearing other people's stories and why they connect. And it might be something very minimal and something not as grand or extravagant as you would think, but it still leaves a mark on you, something you can take away, and it might be something, that's digging deep and you have more questions from it, but that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's, again, honestly, human stories humble me every day. When I think again about this rose-breasted grosbeak and what that bird had to overcome to be in my yard, that's humbling. That it makes, or any bird, if you think about that one bird and what this time of year, what they've had to overcome to grace you with their presence, that's humbling. So when you tell people that, because people will see a bird, they'll see a warbler and they'll be like, oh, it's pretty. I'm like, yeah. So this bird, just depending on where you are, if we're down in Texas, we can talk about some of these birds jumping off of the Yucatan Peninsula the day before. And suddenly they're here. And really, you want to tell me that that's not heroic? That that's not inspiring? I want to break down and cry when I see a freaking redstart. So the human stories come in with that. So many human stories come in with that. So just keep living your life with passion, Nicole. I love that about you. So I hope it's not that long again before we see one another.
I hope so too. Thank you,
Take
Drew.
care.
Okay.
You're very welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Nicole. Anyone else with any questions? Oni.
Hello, everybody. Lovely to see you. Lady in Washington, hi. I saw you before. I don't know what your name is, but nice to see you again. Drew, nice to meet you. And Nicole. It's just really, I am one of those people that you guys are talking about. I know big fat zero about birds. but was inspired because of Mr. Lindo's Instagram account to start looking at the sky. And I even built 2 bird boxes to try and encourage more bird life in my garden. But I'm just wondering, because my love is gardening, and we've just got 2 hives, and I'm trying to rewild the garden and let it do its thing and let nature take it back. So how can I be mindful then of the garden ecology and the stories that I need to learn for that and behind that?
That's a great question. Your name again?
Oni.
Ani?
Yeah.
Let me tell you, I just, and I have a number of them, but this book, I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah.
It's a British book, Hedgerow and Wildlife, A Guide to Animal and Plants of the Hedgerow. And one of the things that intrigues me is how you guys in the UK see nature, and that gardening is such a critical component of it. And I think we have a lot to learn here about it. The concepts of what's wild in America versus what's wild in other places are different. And I think one of the best ways of connecting more diverse peoples to nature is through gardening, because we're purposefully cultivating plants for aesthetics. But we're also cultivating them to eat, and so that's the real soul food, right? And if you're gardening and rewilding, there's a great book out there. There's a great paper about rewilding. If you're doing that, then man, you're making the connections. And I can tell you right now, I would love to be sitting in your garden. I've never seen a European robin. I've never seen your blackbird that's a thrush. And so David, I'm going to have to rely on you. You know what? I've not been to Europe.
We've got to change that.
Yeah, we got to change that, because I want to spend time among hedgerows and gardens. I want to see a stoat. Geez. I've not seen a weasel in North America. I've seen 2, but I want to see a stoat there. I want to see a chaffinch, a bullfinch, and all of those are birds of gardens. And so what might appear ordinary to you is extraordinary to someone else. And if you have hives on top of it, that you have pollinators there, you have the basis for paradise. So remember, in some traditions, in many religious traditions, the garden is where everything sort of started. And so you have the opportunity to have your own Eden or paradise or whatever you want to call it, per se.
Okay, that's great. Well, I'm in Southwest France. So
oh my gosh. You're near the Camargue?
No, Southwest. We're in I'm about an hour from Bordeaux.
Okay. Oh, well, look.
Yeah.
You're in a major migratory pathway, right, David?
Absolutely.
Jeez. A garden? You're going to have stuff that shows up there. David, what will she have coming through this time of year?
Well, you're going to have lots of warblers coming through now, and also plenty of water birds as well. You're in quite a good little spot there, actually, but mostly kind of warblers and birds of prey passing through. So, yeah, you're in a good area. Oni.
Well, yes. Well, at the minute, I hear the cuckoo regularly because our garden backs onto a river, one of the main rivers in the region. So I hear cuckoo regularly. A hookoo in the garden this morning, today.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What does it sound like?
Well, it sounds like cuckoo. That's what it sounds like.
Can I hear it? Can I hear your?
I can't. No, I'm not going to embarrass myself on the internet. Yeah, that's it. And now, interestingly, I go down and because we have a cottage that we want to rent here, and with all the coronavirus thing, it's all tourism is decimated essentially. So I want to start a social media thing, and my daughter told me about something called cottage call, which I'd never heard of before in my life. But it's this real romanticized idea, idealized rural living. So I thought, well, that's not me. And every morning I've been going and recording the sounds I hear down by the river.
Wow.
So I've done that for about 4 days now. And it's actually helped me tune in to the birds in the upper garden by the house a lot better. But I'm trying to by listening to people like you and Jason and David to make I suppose clear a path for myself into this new world, because I've never considered birding before, and I started following David on Instagram because my children say to me, anybody who's black, you follow them just by dint of the fact that they're black. Here's a blackbird, and he had my support. But then it was happenstance that I caught one of his stories and was inspired by that, and found a pair of binoculars in the house and started looking at what was coming in my garden and took it from there, really. But I'm really kind of inspired now to build an ecosystem within the land that we have that is mindful to all living things, I suppose, all creatures.
Would you mind, please? I would love to connect with you on Instagram. I would love to see what you're doing.
Yes, okay, yeah.
I'm at it's at Wild and in Color. One word, Wild and in Color.
Okay, yeah.
Fantastic.
I look forward to that. That'll be cool.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Ani.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And David has inspired lots of people, including me. So that's the power of passion.
Well, the feeling's mutual, I must say. Okay, I think it's come to the time we could be talking all night, and I have other things I could possibly be asking Drew, but I think to ask questions now will probably take another half hour. So I think if no one else has any questions, then maybe we could kind of come to the point in the evening where I ask Drew some questions about his favorite things, starting with, what is your favorite bird, Drew?
Oh gosh. Okay. The smart answer is the one with feathers, but right now it's a rose-breasted grosbeak.
And what's your favorite mammal?
My favorite mammal is, gosh, so many. A wolverine.
Well, that's a good choice.
I love weasels, and that's the king of the weasels.
Certainly is. And what's your favorite invertebrate?
A mayfly, because I mean their lives are so short, but they're full of purpose.
That's true. Favorite plant?
My favorite plant is Joe Pye weed. It can grow to be like 10 or 12 feet tall, and it's sort of a kind of a southern Appalachian kind of thing, but Joe Pye weed.
Okay, and if you could be anywhere in this world, notwithstanding COVID-19, but if you could be anywhere in the world, where would you be right now?
Gosh, you know what? I want to be on the north slope of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge as the flush of shorebirds begins to come in.
Where is that?
I want to see
refuge?
up in it's a space about the size of South Carolina and Alaska, and it's one of the wildest places on Earth. But it connects to South Carolina through birds. So lots of the migratory birds that come through South Carolina are headed to that refuge. And I would like to see the other end of their lives in that very wild place.
Fantastic. You've been an inspiration tonight. You are an inspiration. Thank you very much, Drew, for coming and talking to us during this in Conservation With. I just want to say quickly now, whilst everyone's here, but tomorrow we have a fellow countrywoman, actually, if that can be used instead of countryman, Sharon Stickler. She'll be here same time tomorrow night in the UK. That's 9:30 p.m. Sharon, for those who don't know, I mean, how would you describe her, Drew? You know better than I do.
She's a game changer. She's totally changed the game and opened it up in ways. She's relaxed birding so that more people are comfortable with being birders and not taking themselves so seriously, but taking bird conservation very, very seriously. So Sharon is a game changer.
She's also a friend of Bill Oddie, for those from England.
Yes.
So that's another connection. So she's on tomorrow, and on Tuesday at 4:30 UK time, I have my Serbian brother, Milan Ruzic. I can never pronounce his surname, but basically he's the man that leads tours with me to Serbia to look at the long-eared owls. And Serbia, for those who don't know, is the best place on the planet to see long-eared owls. I mean, I often go to northern Serbia during the winter, and I can see, or I show people, should I say, upwards of 300 or 400 long-eared owls that are roosting in the trees in the streets of the towns there. So it's amazing. But I'm sure that everyone here would like to thank you very much, Drew, for being here today. It's been really inspirational, and I'm sure people have gone away, will go away, thinking very deeply about what you've said. So thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for this, man. And again, the invitation is open to South Carolina. I got places for you to stay, so I look forward to it.
I'm coming, don't worry. As soon as this is all over, my plane is booked.